Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today for this program on Digital Markets Act, Precaution or Innovation. This program has been brought to you by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a world top think tank for science and technology. I'm Elisa Raimondo, the Senior Managing Director at Competition Policy International. On the agenda today, we will be discussing the European Digital Markets Act released by the European Commission last December 2020. Specifically, we will try to understand whether this act will bring innovation or instead will introduce a precautionary approach on how we tackle digital markets in Europe. To talk about this today, we have 4 great antitrust experts. I'm going to welcome them and introduce them very briefly. So welcome Michael Koenig. Michael is advisor on platform regulations at the European Commission. Hi, Michael. Welcome Aurélien Portoise. Aurélien is Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy at the ITIF. Welcome Christian Bergqvist. He's Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen. And I'm not sure whether Thibault has already joined us, but we will, if he's not there yet, he will join anytime soon. Thibault Schrepel is Assistant Professor at Utrecht University School of Law and Faculty Affiliate at Stanford University. Okay, having said so, before jumping into the conversation, just some housekeeping rules for the ones who are watching us and wants to ask some questions. You can do so using the Slido bar at the bottom of the web page or the Slido link if you are watching this on the YouTube channel. And now, let's get started. And I just want to start with a very open question to all of you. If you can summarize and kind of give us 5 takeaways of your views on a DMA proposals. And I'd like to start from you, Michael. Michael, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the organizers and ITIF for organizing this very interesting event and for giving me the opportunity to share my views on the DMA. Now, let's kick it off straight away. I'd like to maybe in the opening give you a few more explanations on the rationale on how we see the DMA from the Commission side, its objective, and then just a few words on 2 key elements, obviously, which is what are gatekeepers and what should the obligations for them look like. Maybe to start with the rationale, I think, and I really want there to be no misunderstandings, that it is obvious that platforms, digital players have had enormous positive effects on both for consumer welfare, but also for enabling and empowering businesses, in particular small businesses. And I think we've seen these effects in particular also during the pandemic. Now, at the same time, I think we've also seen over the past years a deep discussion, and then at the end of this discussion, a consensus emerging that there are issues emerging from large digital gatekeepers, and that we need to look at our toolbox and see whether we can effectively address them with the existing tools that we have. And the conclusions were that we need to edit and add on to the tools that we have in order to address powerful positions that have been established by large digital players when it comes to the access of businesses to their end users. And those positions in particular markets and sectors create strong dependencies that allow for certain behavior and behavior that can be classified as unfair, or practices that then also are able of further cementing already strong positions and thereby drying out the space for alternatives or innovation in the ever-growing ecosystems that we can see around these players. In the beginning, I want to say that there is, for me, no really contradiction between a caution approach and innovation, to the contrary. Now, I think it's also important to stress that the DMA is obviously and visibly inspired by competition law enforcement. It complements competition law enforcement, but it is not competition law. It's not another competition law tool. It's a different regulatory approach, which I think you also very much underline in the reports. It's ex ante regulation. So what does it mean? It's a regulation where obligations are defined upfront by the legislator to prevent behavior which is classified as harmful in terms of fairness and contestability of markets. And indeed, we see one of the value added in such an approach is inter alia the speed and effectiveness of intervention to problems that have been identified and clearly identified. Now, on the question of what are gatekeepers, I think it's important to see that we carefully calibrated the system to designate gatekeepers in order to combine predictability, speed, and proportionality. So we operate with numerical thresholds, but as those can never be exact science, we have flexibility in both directions. On the one hand, gatekeepers or potential gatekeepers may rebut this presumption if they meet the thresholds, but also in the other direction, we can designate as a commission companies that do not meet the thresholds, but that are based on a number of qualitative criteria should be considered gatekeepers. So it is a flexible system that really takes a lot of care in identifying the right companies of gatekeepers, because in this sense, the DMA is a front-loaded instrument. It is more concerned with identifying the gatekeepers because the obligations that derive from this status apply directly and without further individualization. Now, again, the obligations that we have in the list is a careful selection of practices, and it's very, very targeted. It's a list of the most harmful practices which have the most impact in the scenarios that we have. And they are targeted because A, they are to a large part selective when it comes to the services that are actually affected. So again, it's not a company or horizontal approach. It is a very targeted approach which starts with an individual service, and then again the rules as they are again are not general rules that address generally issues like discrimination or the like, but it's specific to a specific scenario where certain practices are identified, or not any tying of different services. Also here, we picked, for example, ID services as a particular issue. So, and as I said, there's no further individualization on their application because the regulatory choice has to be made now, upstream, when we discuss with the co-legislator. But then, in the individual case, we do not hear individual arguments because we have made a clear selection and a clear choice. And I think we see this in other instruments, and we can come to further analogies when we talk further on. But nevertheless, let me also stress that there is a possibility to bring even more legal certainty by a possibility of what we call an enforcement dialogue, where the Commission, at the request of the gatekeepers, can actually be asked to give a clear indication on how, not if, but how a certain obligation has to be really applied within the concrete practice. So I think with this we combine again a target nature. We benefit from the value added of a more efficient and speedy application, but we are targeted and proportionate precisely in order to foster innovation rather than drying it out. Thank you very much. I think this is for me the start, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion with the panelists.
Thank you so much, Michael. In the meantime, I say hello to Thibaut, who managed to join us. Aureliane, back to you. I know that the ITIF has just released a report that analyze the DMA proposals and suggest policy recommendations. I guess you have something to say about these and maybe some reactions to what Michael just said.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for this invitation and for the question. So, of course, we released this ITIF report where we provide a critical assessment of the proposal of the Digital Market Act. But before just looking at those critical points that we may raise, there's two events that just took place today, which frame particularly well the serious criticism that we can legitimately have with the Digital Markets Act. So today is the third anniversary of the GDPR, the General Data Regulation Protection. And this regulation created massive unintended consequences at the expense of European digital companies, consumers, and also overall innovation in Europe. So its main author, member of the European Parliament, Axel Voss, just published today his assessment of the own GDPR he contributed to. And he writes that, I quote, the GDPR abridges other fundamental rights, leads to a compliance cost explosion, and severely hampers Europe's digital transformation, end quote. It refers to some EU decision makers considering the GDPR as, quote, the perfect law or even the privacy Bible. And the Digital Markets Act will be, I think, the GDPR applied to digital competition. The massive unintended consequences are predictable. It may be the competition Bible to some EU decision makers, but the detrimental effect of the DMA are unavoidable. The report ITIF published just today demonstrates that and discussed these considerable unintended consequences. But contrary to the time of when the GDPR was passed, we cannot say with the DMA that we could not predict those unintended consequences because we have plenty of evidence of the GDPR's detrimental effect on citizens, European companies, and overall European innovation. So with the DMA, there's a real risk that the European Commission may hamper Europe's digital transformation, but knowingly. And so there's a second event that took place also today, which framed particularly well the criticism that we may raise in this ITIF report, is precisely that today, Germany just announced its launch of proceedings against Google based on the new German competition law applicable to large digital companies. So the DMA intends to avoid the fragmentation of the digital single market, but on the contrary, not only Commissioner Vestager has recognized in the press conference that it may not stop member states to adopt and adapt their own rules, but also that national rules on digital competition can even go further than the DMA. So the very rationale of the DMA, which is to regulate at the EU level digital competition in order to harmonize these rules, is not even achieved. We'll still have market fragmentation. And this, of course, will prevent small and medium-sized companies to scale up because of this market fragmentation. So not only is the DMA a sort of GDPR applied to digital competition with well-known unintended consequences, but the DMA does nothing about legal fragmentation. And these will hamper European companies to scale up. And so I think the DMA may very well be a regulation, just like Michael has said. It is a regulation. It's not pretty much antitrust. It is a regulation, but without innovation. And it's a regulation that perhaps emphasizes precaution over innovation. So the DMA, I think, completely ignores the way the Gatekeepers ecosystem works. I mean, just one piece of evidence. Last week, on May 17, the Council of the EU just published a report on the DMA proposal. This report points out that some national representatives raised the issue about, quote, whether some obligations should factor in the Gatekeepers ecosystem. And so the Council, in its report last week, just implicitly recognized that the Gatekeepers ecosystems are not taken into consideration in the DMA stringent obligations. So I think that's something that needs to be improved before the final adoption of the Act. So the DMA regulates innovative and disruptive market practices without properly capturing the harm to innovation incentives its obligation may create. There are a number of points that I would like to sum up from the report, and I would like then to have a discussion with the other panelists. So first, the DMA regulates digital markets, right, as opposed to non-digital markets. But there's no such a thing as digital markets. Digital is only one distribution channel, in the sense that digitalized company compete with, well, if that exists, offline companies. Well, in a post-COVID world, I don't know which company is still offline, but let's assume there are some offline companies. Digital world, the digital distribution channel put a strong competitive constraint to offline companies. And so it's not about digital market, but it's all about a digital channel, digital mean, and the competition takes place not on the digital mean, but it takes place on the product market, right? So that's what we do when you go to the grocery. You can buy online or you can buy offline, but the competition takes place on the grocery market. So there shouldn't be a distinction between digital competition and offline competition. And unfortunately, the DMA make this vertical distinction between what is digital and what is not digital without providing a proper definition of the digital markets. Second, the notion of gatekeepers, which is key to the DMA. This notion, as we write in the report, is a very nebulous concept and is prone to detrimental consequences. Well, this creates, of course, an unlevel playing field, as I just said, between digital and non-digital. And only in the digital market, we will regulate only a small set of companies, which are called the gatekeepers. So this creates an even less even playing field between gatekeepers and non-gatekeepers, because as soon as you're just slightly below the threshold, the quantity threshold, then you escape those obligations, and that's a possibility for a lot of companies to engage in trying to avoid these regulatory burden by just being below those regulatory threshold. And this is, of course, detrimental to a fair level playing field for digital competition in Europe. So this is a very detrimental effect, in the sense that gatekeepers, the notion of gatekeepers, create huge threshold effect, as I just said. But I understand the DMA that wants to foster a fair and contestable competition. I think we all agree on the need to foster fair and contestable competition. But I think that it may very well do the opposite, in a sense that if you think of the GDPR, at the end of the day, these large companies, they are harmed, but they will cope with the cost of GDPR. And the same with the DMA. The gatekeepers will be harmed, but they will cope with that cost and the detrimental effect. But the smaller and medium-sized company will not cope up with the cost of the DMA's regulation, in the sense that the DMA almost regulate these gatekeepers as natural monopolies, and therefore reinforced the entrenchment effect of those gatekeepers, in a sense that these companies will be almost like on a daily basis regulated by the European Commission, how the algorithm is changed, is adapted, is adjusted, and as long as they comply with those regulations, then they may keep those market positions. So regulating these large companies, almost like a quasi-natural monopoly, because that's what in practice it will lead to by the application of the essential facility doctrines, that has a huge power of entrenching or as Michael just said, cementing market positions. And that's precisely what we don't want, because this is not fostering competition, right? So we really want to competition and innovation to thrive in Europe, but having a very stringent regulatory obligations to these large gatekeepers will further entrench their power at the expense of those smaller and medium-sized companies. We will have a huge threshold effect, which will be leaved as barriers to expansion. They will just try, those small and medium-sized companies, not to grow in order to avoid being designated as a gatekeeper. So this is very worrying from an innovation perspective. So we can even talk about the concept of foreseeable gatekeepers. So some companies which are not gatekeepers may, because they could foreseeably considered as gatekeeper, may be subject to Article 6 obligations, which themselves are not quite clear and deserve, I think, much clarification. So the very idea of medium-sized company being close to being regulated as digital gatekeepers and possibly regulated as gatekeeper, because there's this concept of foreseeable gatekeeper, then this will just fraud the competition and the ability of these companies to scale up. So now on the obligations, Article 5, Article 6, I'll just go very quickly because I want the discussions to engage with other panelists. As we demonstrate in the report, Article 5 obligations, Article 6 obligations, and also interim measures, so these kind of emergency measures, all partake to the precautionary antitrust, as we discussed it. There's a fundamental shift from antitrust liability, as we know it, where case-by-case issues are dealt with in court, to a regulatory ex-ante obligations. So at least that's clear, right? And we consider that this is very part of the precautionary principle applied to digital competition, because the rhetoric is exactly the same as we know it from the precautionary principle when it's applied to environmental law and to other areas of law. And the consequence will be very much similar, in a sense that disruptive innovation, which of course harmful for traditional players and for incumbents, disruptions and new practices, new business models will be looked at it very, very skeptically under the DMA, and firms will be refrained from disrupting, I think, some of the practices. So this is very, very worrying to some extent. Also, one aspect of this precautionary principle is precisely, and I think this has been said repeatedly by officials, to take antitrust away from the court, right? So you just don't need to go to court and to sue and to have some years in proceedings, and you have a regulatory framework with some compliance. And I think this is somehow dangerous to take antitrust away from the courts, because we know antitrust with legal and economic arguments being debated and discussed and put forward in the open in the courts. And now we will have some regulatory applications without so much of discussion. And even if there is a discussion, as Michael just said, it will be on the ability to rebut the presumption or the designation of being gatekeeper, which may potentially lead to judicial proceedings. Therefore, the very objective of avoiding proceedings by the DMA, with the DMA, it will not just be achieved. So if you contest the designation of gatekeepers, then that will lead to perhaps judicial review, and then the whole purpose of the DMA will be lost. Or if you don't contest it, then of course there will be some access to justice or fundamental right to justice, which will be, jettisoned in some way. So this is part of the precautionary approach, where we apply obligations without companies having the ability to justify the effects, the pro-competitive or anti-competitive effect. And in this very healthy balancing exercise that we see in court for antitrust, well, I think this balancing exercise, of course, is not possible with the DMA, but I believe knowingly and on purpose. And that's how the precautionary approach to disruptive innovation is applied to very complex issues in a very perhaps simple and simplistic way. So there are rooms for improvement of the DMA, and I'll just leave the floor to others in order to discuss these rooms of improvement. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aureliana. You expressed very well your criticism about the DMA. Maybe, Christiana, you have a more balanced view, or you have a less critical view about the DMA. Tell us what you think.
Well, I'm I'm not against the DMA in contrast to Orlean, but I do
That's
have
a good
mixed
news.
feelings. Sorry, can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, yes.
But I have mixed feelings about it, mostly because I feel that it's very much directed at two companies, Google and Facebook, and one business model, that you offer free service as part of an ecosystem. And I don't think that is fair and balanced. I do, however, accept the underlying premise that we should not rely solely on Article 102 to police the sector. But my feeling is that this largely follow from underdeveloped and confusing case law, and I think that leads back to DG Com. In 2005, DG Com actually promised us a paper on the concept of discriminatory abuse, but they never delivered on that. I also think that some of the cases that is advanced as delivered, for instance, Google Shopping, is actually confusing and to some extent not really coordinated internally. If, for instance, we take Google Shopping, we will initially see that the abuse is defined as self-favoring, where only Google's own services and offerings are allotted premium displaying. But then it's later explained, no, that's not the abuse. The abuse is actually the malicious downgrading of alternative. I think DG Com wanted to target the later, and particularly because I don't think self-favoring is an infringement of Article 102. But I think that to some extent you could argue DG Com has actually failed explaining in Google Shopping what the abuse is. So case law is underdeveloped and confusing, and I think that largely falls back to DG Com. If we actually look into the DMA, some of the 18 commands do actually look slightly more balanced. For instance, the prohibition on bundling and wide parity clauses, and you could also argue that these have already been condemned in case law. So that actually looks fair and balanced, in contrast to the mandatory access and unbundling obligations. So my feeling is that yes, there is some room and some justification for the DMA, but I do have issues with certain elements of it, particularly the fact that it very much is directed at two companies and one business model.
Thank you, Christian. That's very, very, very clear. Thibault, the last word on these particular opening remarks. What do you think? Where do you stand?
Sure. First of all, I'm delighted to be with you. I thought I would be, if you give me 2 minutes, I can make 3 points, if that's a fair deal.
It's a fair deal.
All right, great. I mean, first of all, I think the general philosophy of it, I like it very much. I think it's excellent that a competition agency or the European Commission will look at it from the infrastructure perspective, and not just one tiny technology at a time. So this for me goes in the right direction. The 3 points that I would like to make are proposals, in a sense, or at least to put that on the table and see what you think of it, because I think we have room to improve the DMA as it is. First, on the definition of the gatekeeper, I'm not sure if the DMA, such as it is drafted today, will actually only capture 6 to 10 companies. I think it might capture almost over 100 companies. Let us take the example of a car manufacturer that will introduce an operating system in his car. Should the car manufacturer have lots of customers, be above that threshold, could it be possible to say that it is then covered by the DMA, because an operating system might be necessary for business users to, put some apps, etc., etc. So it seems to me that it may create an incentive not to integrate an operating system in a car if the car manufacturer is not into this type of design already. So, but this could be easily fixed. I think it's just a matter of reframing the definition of the gatekeeper. That's point number one. For point number two, if you could see on my screen right now, I think we could see 4 different types of competition when it comes to digital markets. And it seems to me that the DMA is very much focusing on this one, which is startup eventually competing with the tech giants by providing a substitute product. I'm not sure if I can think of a single example of this happening in the last 20 years. I think what we see is startup being successful when they propose something which is a non-substitute, and especially big tech companies being successful when they propose a substitute, right? So there are lots of examples. And here I took a fake example of Apple introducing a new social media. Right now, this will be made more complex because of the DMA, namely because Apple cannot leverage its existing market power to put this potential Apple friends on top of its App Store, for instance. Neither could Apple use some personal data coming out of the iPhone to improve that new social media. And that is just a way, again, of framing Article 6 and 5, where we could say, if you are a gatekeeper, you cannot leverage your market power against startup. However, you can and should actually leverage your market power against other gatekeepers. So this, again, is a proposal that I would like to put on the table. And the third point is that I think the DMA is a nest for litigation. We're going to see lots of litigation because some of the obligations in Article 5 and 6 are not so clear. And in any case, companies will always argue that they are outside the boundaries. And this leads me to two sub-points. First, why not decentralizing the enforcement? I was very astonished to see that the DMA and the DSA came together the same day, and yet one is in favor of decentralizing enforcement while the DMA is not so much. Now, I understand we have Article 22 and potentially we are going in a way of more decentralization, but I would love to see national competition agencies involved in that. And the second point is that in any case, even though it is ex ante, companies will try to escape, and we need to actually discuss how competition agencies, and here the DG Comp, could use technologies to improve their enforcement capacities. So those are the two sub-points that I wanted to make. And again, I'm delighted to have the discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Thibaut. And actually, this what you just said brings me to the next question and the next topic that I'd like to focus, which is precisely enforceability. We all know, because of our legal background, that for all legal systems to be really effective, they need to be enforceable. And my question to you, do we really think that the rules as they are set out in the DMA will be easily enforceable? And if so, how do we avoid fragmentation or possible conflicting rules and decisions among NCAs or other authorities? I'm thinking about rules on privacy, IP, or consumer protections law. That's so. My question to you is, how do we see really the DMA behave vis-a-vis and interact with like this concept of enforceability? Anybody who wants to jump on this?
I mean, I can just, it seems to me that the detectability rate is already extremely low when it comes to competition law, and this is why we may want to have the DMA to complement it. We have some empirical studies that, most of the time, if you infringe competition law, you'll be fine in the US and in Europe, especially. And so that leads me to the following observation. Last year, we produced 44 zettabytes of data. I didn't know what a zettabyte was. It's a lot of data. This is 40 times more bytes than there are stars in the universe. This was last year. In 5 years, we're going to multiply by 5 that number. And in 10 years, it will be over 2,000 zettabytes of data from 40 today. So we need, again, to reinforce the capacities to detect infringement, and including for the DMA, because otherwise we will capture a few practices, but it might be 2, 3, 4% of those practices.
Great, thank you, Thibaut. Michael, maybe you want to kind of rebut and comment on all what we have been said so far?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to make a few comments. Let's maybe, before we move to enforcement, I think maybe just to one question I think is really overarching here is like, what type of contestability, what type of sources of innovation do we see? And is the DMA right in fostering those? I think this is probably one theme that I saw a little bit across the different interventions. And Thibaut, I think your classification is very helpful also in that respect. I still believe we have to look at these things sort of carefully. I think apart from the first column, where you see like startups really replacing sort of services engaged in by gatekeepers, I think we should not be sort of too pessimistic that this may happen, because this is also disruptive. And I think the borderline between what is a substitute and what is not a substitute is very, very fluent, in my view, very, very, very blurred. because not all services are exactly the same. Yeah, so I think we should, in that respect, not be too pessimistic. And frankly, I don't see the DMA really having threshold effects in that respect. I mean, if you see where the thresholds are, I mean, we would be very happy to see any startup to thrive up to these thresholds. But honestly, I think that is still really far away from when people start their activities. And as I said, the two flexibility elements in the designation really allow us to take care of these type of elements to really look into it in more depth. Yeah. Now the other question was also, shall we enable competition, or are we preventing competition between gatekeepers, which I understand you also see as a major source of competition? Well, I'm enforcing this contestability realistically. And I think first we have to have a very sort of honest look at those relationships, because we've seen also relationships which are a very sort of mutually beneficial cooperation. When we look, for example, between one smartphone manufacturer and a major search engine provider, yeah, which leads to a very cozy synergies, but which I would not call competition and contestability between the two. So let's also not close our eyes about those dynamics. And secondly, I think we're very happy if gatekeepers start innovative services and contest the positions of others, but based on the merits. I don't think that we should say, well, if other companies have achieved their entrenched positions with certain practices, we should not stop these practices, but we should allow others to also employ and deploy these harmful practices to come at the same level. I think that is definitely not the approach that we would take from our side. But let me quickly say a few words on enforcement. I think that's obviously a key objective to have the rules and the whole system enforceable. One element is indeed we want to avoid market fragmentation, and this is the reason why we do not have a decentralized application of the DMA, because this is precisely the recipe for fragmentation, that you have 27 authorities applying and interpreting the rules of the DMA. More fragmentation, I think, is hard to imagine. On the other hand, we will need the support of national authorities when it comes to be the eyes and the ears of the Commission. So we're very happy for them to be the first port of call for complaints, for the question whether the rules are actually working on the ground, alert us and play their role in supporting in the Commission in its work in enforcing the DMA. But again, I think it has to be a way of cooperation rather than competing and parallel application of the rules, not only competition rules, but also others. And I think here is also clear that we need a well-functioning dialogue with national authorities to decide which is the best and the most efficient tool and level to address certain problems or issues that shall be tackled. And this dialogue has to work very well. But I'm very confident that we get there, and that in the end, everybody has an interest to deploy its resources in those instruments that make the most impact on the ground. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. That's very useful and good to hear. Maybe Christian, you have any comment on the enforceability, anything to add to what you just said?
We will need to see the final product before we make any decision on that. But I think we'll see a lot of discussion, perhaps even legal actions, because some of the definitions are quite clear, others are open for interpretation. For instance, what is a search engine? It is only search engines who are granted mandatory access to the internal information at, for instance, Google search engine. And these are very valuable, and for the purpose of deep learning, it might be very attractive to for companies actually to get access to this information. And therefore, you will have a discussion: are you or are you not a search engine? So as some of the provisions are confined to certain competitors, we will have a lot of discussion about that. So that could be an issue.
Okay, thank you. Thibault, Aurélien, you want to comment on that? or shall we move on?
You're muted.
Yes.
Someone
so
had
one
to
comment
pronounce
very
that.
quickly on the entrenchment effect. I think there's a real risk of the entrenchment, but also threshold effect in the DMA. If you think of these small and medium-sized European company who may think of merging in order to compete with gatekeepers. I mean, a merger between 2 or 3 small and medium-sized company, well, you may very quickly reach those thresholds. So it will have a great impact also on the decision by smaller and medium-sized company to merge, because thinking of merging now for medium-sized European digital companies, I mean, you cannot avoid thinking about the regulatory framework that will apply to the merged company, right? So irrespective of the merger laws and merger reviews, let's assume the merger is approved or there's a great chance of approval, the very prospect of being subject to Article 5 and Article 6 may not very look like an attractive future for these merged firms. And so a European small and medium-sized company, if it merged with an American company or with another company and may just perhaps develop its own business elsewhere than in Europe, they may perhaps escape Article 5 or Article 6 obligations. They may try to circumvent those obligations. So what I'm saying is that that will chill out innovation and also the rate of scaling up for medium-sized European companies.
Great, thank you. That's actually very useful and helps me bring to this other thing and issue that I've been thinking as a European Italian, actually living abroad in the United States. I'd like to ask you, what do you think the DMA position itself within the global scale? We ultimately are discussing here the DMA within the European market, but I'm really careful, and sometimes I follow with some sort of agony all my European colleagues and entrepreneurs in Europe that are struggling to be successful abroad, outside. And I wonder whether you think that the DMA, and in particular Brussels, can actually lead with these set of rules the conversation on digital economy. Anybody who wants to take this first?
If I may.
Okay, yeah, sure, Thibault.
And I will make the junction between your question, what Aurélien just said. There is a great paper that was published earlier this year by Philippe Aguillon called The Impact of Regulation on Innovation. And he's actually showing that the impact is different depending on whether you are close to the technological frontier or not. And at the end, I think this is what we will see. It will impact companies differently depending on the tech that they are offering on the market. And for that reason, I mean, I agree that, we won't see anytime soon Google or Facebook or any of those companies saying, well, the DMA is applying in Europe, let's leave the market. I mean, let's be realistic. They will always try to be on our market. But depending on the technology, it might be that we will see certain services and products in which certain features will be taken out of the European market, as they have already started to do when it comes to Australia, for instance, and all the markets. So this might be one of the effects. And it is really hard to measure. And again, it will come down to enforcement activities, probably back to competition law. So my main message is that the technology matters very much. And I'm not sure if we can actually predict an equally, an equal effect on all of those big tech companies.
Any other that wants to jump on this? Michael.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think the first point is to say that, with the DMA, we want to respond to pressing issues with digital gatekeepers for the benefit of any companies, but in particular European companies that rely on them and have to rely on them, and that are enabled by them, but also have to rely on them. And I think, so we are not seeking here a race for a first mover or anything like that. I mean, we are responding responsibly to an issue that we see. But again, this is not a selective instrument. It's about behavior of companies that we define with certain criteria, and practices where we also have a broad basis. And I referred to the beginning at a broad discussion and emerging consensus that there's a need to act which is really internationally and not only limited to the EU. Now, obviously, we are very optimistic and hope that with this we further foster this discussion about internationally about standards when it comes to digital markets and digital players, and we get further convergence on the principles, and this will certainly also feed into our dialogue with our US counterparts in the context of the Technology and Trade Council, for example. So I think we look definitely forward to and hope that we spark a further debate and further convergence around these questions. But at the same time, we take our own responsibilities and therefore act now in this way. On the risk of differentiation, if I see like that you mentioned, Thibaut, I think again it's probably a risk assessment. I mean, again, we already talk about companies that are sort of by definition active across the several member states, across the EU, and typically also deploy global business models. So indeed, I think we will have to see, but at the same time, our starting point is also, who is doing business in Europe has to respect Europe's rules. So I think if that may lead to certain differentiation to comply with these rules, I think this is something that is just a consequence of this approach.
Thank you, Michael. Christian, do you have anything to add on what we just said?
Yes, I have, because I actually think that DMA served two goals. There are some valid concerns when it comes to platform, and that could be an aspiration for other jurisdiction. But we also have to be honest, there's also a tacit and hidden agenda that is essentially who should be in the driver's seat. And you see right now that member states are adopting national version of DMA, that will leave the Commission out of the loop. So of course, this is also a question about, who should be in the driver's seat, and Vestager and the Commission very much want to be the driver's seat. And I don't think that could be inspiration for other jurisdictions.
Thank you, Christian. Aurélien.
Yeah, just to follow up on Christian's point and the previous question on the Europe's role in the digital competition. I think we all know that digital companies just benefit by scale economies and by size. The network effects are extremely powerful in the digital economy, and that's something that is well known. And I think the rationale for the DMA is very legitimate to avoid legal fragmentation. I mean, it should achieve that, but unfortunately it doesn't achieve legal fragmentation. We know we need a single market, a purely integrated single market for digital companies in order for Europeans ones to grow up and to scale up. Also a capital market that can spur some money into the digital companies that is very necessary. But the Digital Market Act doesn't achieve this legal fragmentation. So perhaps I have one question for Michael. Say, like, why could the European Commission not prevent national rules on digital competition to be adopted? Because we know Germany has pioneered on that respect in last January. But I mean, of course, France, Italy, Spain, I mean, the 28 member states will follow suit. And so we'll have one DMA at the European level, plus like tens of regulations, if not like local regulations as well, if you are part of a federal state. And so that will just lead to this legal fragmentation, which is at the core of the greatest impediments for European companies to scale up. Why can't the European Commission preclude member states? I know it's politically difficult, but let's assume for the sake of argument, why can't it preclude member states to just adopt regulation on digital competition?
Michael, do you want to respond to Aurélien?
Sure. No, I think again we fully subscribe to the objective that we should avoid and limit fragmentation in the internal market, because this is what the name is about. It's one market, and I already referred to this being also the reason when it comes to decentralized enforcement of the DMA itself. When it comes to the relation to national rules, I think we have to first distinguish competition law and other sort of rules, which are not an equivalent to the competition rules that we have in the treaty. Because in the relation to competition law, also on our side, the Commission can continue to apply Articles 102 of the treaty, and that, as this can also be implemented by member states, this right shall also remain with member states. When it comes to other rules, I think again we have to be clear what the DMA does as a starting point. It is establishing and this is a harmonized canon of rules for gatekeepers across the EU. But because for reasons of predictability, proportionality, etc., we have to be very specific and targeted in these rules. They will not be exhaustive. They cannot be exhaustive. So what we here establishing is really a first layer, if you want, of specific rules for gatekeeper companies, and in those areas there is no room for national laws. National laws can go beyond if they are selective, if they either target other gatekeepers or they tackle other practices that we have not identified in the DMA. But I think when it comes to the rules that we have in the DMA and how they are to be understood and implemented, here we have a harmonizing effect that the way those rules and these practices are tackled there is one authority, the Commission, which will specify how they have to be implemented, and this is then applicable across the EU and does not leave for this field, this harmonized field, space for member states to deviate.
Great, thank you. We are running out of time, and we have some questions from the audience. I'd like, for example, to address this one. How is expected to affect this, like the DMA expected to affect the cryptocurrencies? Now, I don't know if some of you wants to respond. I might think that Thibault has something to say, but I don't know if anyone else wants to jump on this.
So, if you stick with the definition of the gatekeeper as it is, what is intended or implied in the definition is that you have a legal entity behind it, right? That's where you should start the analysis. When it comes to blockchain, and especially public permissionless blockchain, and I know this is not the subject of the conference, so let me just say that those are not organized horizontally. They are not organized vertically like a firm. They are organized horizontally with no clear boundaries. So you don't have a clear legal fiction. So I'm not even sure if you should think about applying the DMA to a non-legal fiction in the first place. So this is the first issue to be solved, and then we'll discuss the DMA and the impact. I'm not sure if it's there, but it could be interesting.
Michael, any reaction to that? Any comment?
Well, first of all, let's again stress that the DMA is very selected in the services, the specific services that it targets. So it really defines on what type of digital service is covered by the obligation. So it's not one company and then once designated, whatever service they undertake and offer is captured by the obligations. It is really very selective on the individual service that is captured, so I think this is one thing. At the same time, maybe I should add that those obviously can and will in the future probably have to be amended, but this is something which really is through a revision of the Act. So I think that is just a core of the whole tool. The other element is that we have obligations which are concerned about precisely leveraging the existing market power of gatekeepers from their core platform services, as we call them, to other services. And this is where here other services which are not in scope at the moment can be affected. So that again here competition is on the merit. But I think when it comes to cryptocurrencies, there are many more regulatory considerations from financial services, etc., which are not the subject of the DMA, of course.
Okay, Aurélien.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah. Of course, the DMA regulates digital payments, right? Things like Google Pay or Apple Pay will be part of the DMA. And these, I mean, the question is very interesting because it's perhaps emphasize the lack of forward-looking obligations of the DMA. These instruments, Google Pay, Apple Pay, or whatever digital payments, will be disrupted itself by cryptocurrencies. What I'm saying is that the assumption, part of the DMA, that these powers, these market positions are unassailable, are just entrenched up to a point that they won't be challenged. There's the assumption of unassailability, right? This assumption is just not holding truth, because we know that blockchain will disrupt these big tech players, and it's just a matter of months or perhaps years, but it will take place.
May I say something? Yes, not that I want to talk about blockchain necessarily, but something I haven't read yet is how the DMA will actually work along with the new AI regulation, or at least the draft proposal by the European Commission, because they have kind of the same perspective, which is the DMA, you look at certain core services. The new AI regulation is that you look at use cases and not the way by which you design AI. But some of those companies will be concerned by the two, right? Mm-hmm. If you design a search engine with unsupervised learning in a way which is high risk because you can't really control, you are then both within the DMA and the AI, in which you have to disclose information to the European Commission. It will be interesting to see if information could actually go through all of those DG.com, DG Connect, or if it will be prohibited or not. But this should be a subject for discussion, I think.
Great. I think we are 4 minutes to the end. So I'd like to give you all an opportunity to conclude, and I'll do that asking 2 questions. You decide whether you want to answer to those or you want to instead just like give your own final remarks. And the 2 questions I have for you is, if there was something that you would like to change on the DMA, what would that be? And 5 years assessment. How do you see the DMA? How would you assess the success of the DMA in 5-year times? And with that, I'll leave you the floor to all of you to kind of conclude this debate. Who wants to start?
Can I start?
Yeah, please, Christian.
I think, I think I largely draw justification for the DMA in the fact that case law and Article 102 is underdeveloped. There are also political consideration, but that's my justification for it. And I would very much like to see case law move forward. So my end goal, which I don't think is realistic, but I would very much like to see the DMA become redundant, So in 5 years, we don't actually need it anymore. That would be my end goal. It's not realistic, but that was something I would love.
Okay, that's great. Succinct enough. Michael.
Yes, thank you. I think you will be surprised if I say, well, to a certain extent, in one aspect I share is I would hope that maybe not in 5 years' time, but a little bit further down the road, the enforcement of the DMA will be obsolete, because we will see an upstream effect, which is really the rationale and the idea of these rules. It's like that gatekeepers comply upstream, that we do not have to enforce in individual cases as we do in competition law, but that this is really selective to borderline questions, but that on a broad and large scale, we will not see enforcement decisions in the DMA because there's compliance upstream. I think that is, I hope, a less unrealistic, but really one of the goals that we would like to achieve with this new tool. Thanks.
That would be ideal. Aurélien.
Yeah, well, since we are on unrealistic prospects, I can have mine. So the unrealistic prospect is for the DMA to not regulate gatekeepers, but to regulate digital competition, gatekeepers and non-gatekeepers irrespectively. So just to create a stronger level playing field. And in 5 years' time, how we'll see the DMA, I think it would be a great success, which I think it's completely unrealistic, if a lot of European medium-sized company will become gatekeepers and will be happy to be subject to gatekeepers' regulations and won't be deterred from being a gatekeeper. So if becoming a gatekeeper in Europe and being heavily regulated is not deterring the size and growth of European digital companies, then I may be wrong. But unfortunately, as I just said, it's quite unrealistic, and I think companies will think about twice before becoming a regulatory gatekeeper in Europe.
Thibault, last word to you.
Exactly. Since I'm the last, I thought I will answer the two questions. In 5 years, I would say, and very, very much agree with Michael, it will be a success if we have very few litigations. And something also I'd be curious to see is the European Commission developing some metrics to measure the way by which he improved consumer welfare. I think showing the fine and calculating the fines imposed to companies is one thing, but I would like to see how it translates to consumers. And what I would change, as I said already, I think Article 5 and 6 could be changed to a law leveraging power to be used by so-called gatekeepers against other gatekeepers. It could be pro-competitive. We have many examples of where it has been done and benefited consumers. So this is just half a sentence to be added to those two articles. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we are now at the very end of our debate. It was very lively, interesting, and insightful. Of course, we have a long way to go before the adoption of final adoption of this regulation. But we do hope that these recommendations, these comments, like many other that is coming all around from different parties, will be taken into account for the benefit not only of the gatekeepers, the small medium firms, but also, why not, the end users and the customers, because ultimately competition law should serve to all of us. With this, I want to thank you all, my panelists, all the people and the audience that is watching us from all over the world, hopefully. And please, if you want to see the recording, you can do that either tuning in on the ITIF website or on the YouTube channel of the ITIF. And with this, I wish you a great day, and thank you again for watching.
Thank you.